receive more from a public intellectual, though Chomsky himself would and often has declined that label. So with that, I introduce Professor Noam Chomsky.
Thanks, Martin. Well, we're shifting gears a bit, but I presume you've made that transition. U.S.-Iran relations really begin in 1952, when the British were attempting to overthrow the parliamentary regime and were incapable of doing so, and called in the big muscle from overseas, just as they had done a couple of years earlier in Greece. What's particularly striking about U.S.-Iranian relations since that auspicious moment is the radical asymmetry, which is very much reminiscent of the famous words of Athenian conquerors to Melos 2,500 years ago, responding to the plea for justice on the part of the weaker people of Melos. And they responded that what is right as the world goes is only in question between equal power, while the strong do what they wish and the weak suffer as they must. Doctrine that has held for 2,500 years without very much change. The doctrine of imperial Athens at the height of its power captures very accurately the relations between the United States and Iran, ever since the United States displaced Britain as the global hegemonic power in the Middle East, in fact, in the world. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I think it's first kind of useful to think about the general geostrategic background in which U.S.-Iranian relations found their place. So prior to World War II, the United States was by far the richest country in the world. In fact, it had been for a long time. But it was not the major actor in world affairs. That role was held by Britain, secondarily France. The United States, of course, did have a long history of foreign intervention, but it was mostly Latin America, some forays into the Pacific around the turn of the century. But U.S. international expansion greatly increased when the world began to shift to an oil economy at the beginning of the 20th century. The United States itself was the leading oil producer for most of the period since. It is again right now. But that, in fact, is pretty much irrelevant to policy, contrary to what's often believed. I'll come back to that. So a century ago, major oil resources were discovered in Venezuela. That at the time was a British dependency. The Woodrow Wilson administration took care of that, kicked the British out. The US took over and basically ran the country until 1999, when Hugo Chavez was elected. Chavez quickly began to move on an independent course. He managed to persuade the OPEC countries, the major oil cartel, to reduce production, to raise prices for the benefit of the South. The United States didn't like that. In 2002, shortly after, there was a military coup in Venezuela, throughout the executive, disbanded parliament, dismissed the courts. It was openly and enthusiastically supported by the United States, no secret about it. And the press was also very enthusiastic about this achievement. Well, the coup was quickly overturned by a popular uprising, and since then the United States has had to resort to subversion, sabotage to try to restore things to their proper course. By the 1920s, it was recognized that the Middle East was going to be the major center of oil production. At the time, its resources were divided between Britain and France. Red Line Agreement, it was called. The United States was not satisfied with that. It demanded and achieved a role within for the division of Middle East resources. Things changed substantially 10 years later in the 1930s when enormous oil reserves were discovered in Saudi Arabia. And then the question is, who's going to run those? The US and Britain contended over that. In fact, right through the Second World War, there was a kind of a mini war between the United States and Britain as to who would take control of Saudi Arabia, given the circumstances. The outcome was never really in doubt for obvious reasons. Well, by that time, Second World War, the US government analysts recognized that Middle East oil was, I'll just quote their own words, Middle East oil is a stupendous source of strategic power, one of the greatest material prizes in world history, and probably the richest economic prize in the world in the field of foreign investment, the most strategically important area in the world, in President Eisenhower's words. We can almost say that since that time, it's been close to axiom one of international affairs, that the US will do whatever it can to ensure that it controls this enormous prize. Now, it is not that the United States itself needed the oil. That's important to understand. In fact, it did not. For most of this period, the US has been the major oil producer as it is today. But the actual reasons have been explained by leading statesmen. So George Kennan, one of the founders of the structure of the post-war world, he had pointed out that control of Middle East oil, it gives the United States what he called veto power over other industrial economies, including primarily our allies. They rely on the resource. We have our hand on the pump. Gives you a lot of power. More recently, same point was reiterated by Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the most influential current strategic analysts, policy planners. He was kind of critical of the invasion of Iraq. He didn't think it was a good idea. But he did say that if we managed to control Iraq, that would give the United States, I'm quoting him, critical leverage on the European and Asian economies that depend on Middle East oil. There's an enormous effort in the United States to pretend that the United States didn't care about oil when it invaded Iraq. So we would have done the same thing if Iraq's major export was asparagus and the main source of Middle East oil was in South Pacific or something. But you can believe that if you like. That's the standard line. Well, but I think these insights of Kennan and Brzezinski, others, pretty much explain the thinking behind the axiom one of world affairs. Again, policy has remained the same, whether the US was using parts of Middle East oil or wasn't. That didn't matter, because the same issues arise. Well, by the end of World War II, the United States was the unquestioned global hegemonic power with in fact, on a scale that had no historical precedent. So what happened to the Middle East? Well, there was first the problem of France. They had part of Middle East oil. They were unceremoniously dismissed on the grounds that France was an enemy power, since it had been occupied by the Germans. And so they lost their part of it. As far as the British were concerned, it's more nuanced, but over time, the United States gradually displaced a fading Britain, were greatly weakened, of course, by the war. And the British had absolutely no illusions about what was happening. They have a sophisticated foreign affairs bureaucracy. And the British Foreign Office, I'll just quote them, recognized that the economic imperialism of American business interests is quite active under the cloak of a benevolent and avuncular internationalism and is attempting to elbow us out. Americans believe that the United States stands for something in the world, something of which the world has need, something which the world is going to like, something in the final analysis which the world is going to take, whether it likes it or not. That's internal records, not what you read in the New York Times or learn in school. And it's a rather lucid version of the Athenian doctrine. Well, Iran did have enormous oil resources. They were controlled by Britain. As you all know, the Mossadegh government sought to nationalize the industry. Britain tried but failed to crush the effort. At that point, they called on the US to intervene, and it did succeed in overthrowing the parliamentary government in 1953, installing the dictatorship of the Shah. And as is entirely normal, this achievement was recognized and applauded, publicly applauded. So, for example, the editors of the New York Times explained that as a result of this achievement, quote them, underdeveloped countries with rich resources now have an object lesson in the heavy cost that must be paid by one of their number, which goes berserk with fanatical nationalism, as the Iranians had done. It's perhaps too much to hope that Iran's experience will prevent the rise of Mossadeghs in other countries, but that experience may at least strengthen the hands of more reasonable and more far-seeing leaders. That means leaders who have a clear-eyed understanding of US priorities. That's the New York Times, very typical. Same with the Venezuelan coup, same with the Brazilian coup in 1964, in fact, quite standard. Well, Iran's resources were then went back to British hands, but not completely, in a way that's quite interesting. Washington insisted that about 40% of Iran's resources go to US corporations. US should take over almost half of the Iranian resources. US corporations objected. They didn't want to do that because they could lift oil more economically from Saudi Arabia, where all you have to do is stick a hole, a hand pipe in the land, and oil comes up. So US corporations didn't want to do it, but they were forced to by the US government under severe threat. They were compelled to take over substantial Iranian resources. The reason was that the Eisenhower administration, they have global concerns. They represent the long-term global interests of the corporate sector, not the local, parochial, short-term interests of profit tomorrow, which is quite an interesting development and worth remembering because it's quite similar to what's happening right now before our eyes. We don't have internal documents yet, but you can pretty well assume that US oil corporations would be very pleased to be able to move into the Iranian market, take their share of this enormous resource, just as Boeing, other corporations, US corporations, of course, would like to enter the Iranian market. But they're barred by state power, which once again has longer term concerns. As the state interest in punishing Iran overwhelms the parochial interests in short-term profit. So it's rather similar to what happened in the early 50s. And it's not the only such case. Another one close by is Cuba, where US corporations have been very eager for years to exploit the Cuban market, especially US pharmaceutical corporations interested in connections with advanced pharmaceutical industry in Cuba. But they're barred by state power, which again has to punish Cuba for its crimes. In this case, we do have internal records. It's far enough back. The crime of Cuba is successful defiance of Washington. It's the way the CIA described the crime in the early 1960s. Now, this was at a time when the Kennedy administration was carrying out a major terrorist war against Cuba. No laughing matter, in fact, almost led to terminal destruction during the global Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, examples like these are of a lot of interest for the general study of foreign relations. So it's no secret that the corporate sector pretty much controls the state. But there are moments when state power, which is upholding long-term corporate interests, overwhelms more parochial concerns for short-term gains. And Iran today is a case in point. It's another case of the crime of successful defiance since 1979. Well, this threat of successful defiance resonates through the internal documentary record, if you look at it. And it's not by no means original to the United States. In fact, it's traditional. King George III in the 1770s was concerned about the successful defiance of the American colonies and the consequences this might have for erosion of the British Empire. He was joined by great statesmen of Europe, the Tsar, Metternich, who were deeply concerned by the spread of very dangerous Republican heresies and what this might do to world order. These are principles that endure consistently over long periods, very much like the doctrine of imperial Athens 2,500 years ago. Well, turning to as soon as the Shah was installed, Iran became a valued US client state. In fact, it was one of the pillars of local regional control of the Middle East, along with the Saudi family dictatorship. They were joined by Israel in 1967, became a third pillar. And it was in 1967 that US-Israeli relations were established in the form which still persists today, quite different from before. And there were good reasons for it. And these developments provide very important background for understanding what's happening right now in the region. So what happened in 1967? Well, in 1967, Israel performed a huge service to the United States and its Saudi ally. Israel destroyed the center of secular Arab nationalism, Nasser's Egypt, which the United States regarded as a bitter enemy, condemned as Hitlerian. Generally, very much like Britain before it, the United States has tended to support radical Islam in opposition to secular nationalism, which is considered a much more severe threat because of the danger of its spread to others. At the time, in the mid-1960s, there was a war going on between radical Islamist Saudi Arabia and secular nationalist Nasserite Egypt. And Israel solved that problem, destroyed secular nationalism, supported radical Islam. The US relations with Israel immediately became unique in world affairs, have remained so. Further Israeli services to US power have simply intensified that. There's no time to go into it. But in any way, that was a crucial moment for modern Middle East history. Well, US-Israeli-Iranian relations also became quite close at that time. It wasn't official, but unofficially, Israel had what was in effect an embassy in Iran, in Tehran, and the de facto Israeli ambassador Uri Librani, he reported after the fall of the Shah, he reported that the entire top Israeli political echelon had been visiting Iran regularly. That includes David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, Moshe Dayan, Yitzhak Rabin, Menachem Begin, in fact, all of them. He also described the very warm relations that developed between Israel's Labor Party, which was governing at the time, and the notorious secret police of Iran, the Savak, which in fact was hosting and arranging the visits of the labor ministers to Tehran. Had serious analysts in the United States who were also quite cognizant of the tacit tripartite Israel, Iran, Saudi alliance on which the United States relied for local control of the Middle East. The Senate's ranking oil expert, Senator Henry Jackson, and I'm quoting him, he emphasized the strength and Western orientation of Israel on the Mediterranean and Iran on the Persian Gulf, two reliable friends of the United States who, along with Saudi Arabia, have served to inhibit and contain those irresponsible and radical elements in certain Arab states who, if they were free to do so, would pose a grave threat indeed to our principal sources of petroleum in the Persian Gulf. Again, notice resources the United States didn't need and barely used, but they were needed as a reserve and a lever of world domination. At the same time, the Nixon Doctrine had established Iran and Israel as the cops on the beat, as they were called by Defense Secretary Melvin Laird. The police headquarters, of course, remains in Washington. The cops on the beat were to ensure that radical nationalists, as they're called, would not pose a danger to order. Robert Repa, who is one of the main Defense Intelligence Agency analysts on the Middle East, wrote that Israeli power protected the regimes of Jordan and Saudi Arabia from a militarily strong Egypt in the 1960s, settled in 1967. And then the Israeli-Iranian relationship continued to contribute to the stability, what we call the stability of the region. Stability means securing US interests. That's very much what the situation was like from 67 till 79, when Iran moved again to successful defiance. And there's an earlier record too, which is worth looking at. As early as 1958, the National Security Council had concluded that what they called a logical corollary of opposition to radical Arab nationalism would be to support Israel as the only strong pro-Western power left in the Middle East. And 10 years earlier, 1948, Israel's military successes in the 1948 war had led the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff to describe Israel as the major regional military power after Turkey, offering the United States to gain what they called strategic advantage in the Middle East to become a base for U.S. power. That now could go into the details, but it is basically a U.S. base in the Middle East, no questions about it. Well, what about the Palestinians? Back in 48, the U.S. planners had no reason to doubt the assessment of Israeli government specialists that, as they put it, the Palestinian refugees would either assimilate elsewhere or would be crushed. Some of them would die, and most of them would turn into human dust and the waste of society and join the most impoverished classes in the Arab countries. So there wasn't any particular reason to concern oneself about them. Well, without comment, it should be clear that the roots of today's circumstances and policies are actually quite deep, haven't changed much. Well, as far as Iran was concerned, all remained in order until 1979. Shah was overthrown, the era of successful defiance began. And as you can imagine, that the overthrow of the Shah was a very serious shock to the United States and its Israeli ally, probably to Saudi Arabia, but the Saudi Arabian government is so totalitarian that we have absolutely no records of anything that goes on inside them. You have to just guess, but you can make a successful guess. The chief of the Israeli Mossad, Secret Service, Jacob Nimrodi, who was actually in Iran undercover, he urged that the West and Israel carry out a military coup to return Iran to proper behavior, the normal response. Uri Librani, the ex-de facto ambassador, he thought that this shouldn't be too difficult. As he put it, Tehran could be taken over by a small force, determined, ruthless, cruel, men emotionally geared to killing 10,000 people. So that should be enough to reverse this heresy. President Carter, president at the time, sent a NATO general, Robert Heuser, to Iran, apparently to see if he could find elements in the Iranian military, which had been closely linked to the United States, who might be able to implement a coup, but that effort failed, and Iran went off on its own way. Not for long. Iraq immediately invaded. 1980, Iraq invaded, and as you know, it was a terrible war. Interestingly, Israel continued to provide arms to Iran during the Iraq-Iran war, presumably to try to maintain relations with elements in the Iranian military, and probably also in the hope and expectation that both sides in the war would simply destroy themselves, would be weakened. That's pretty much what happened. The United States, in contrast, provided very strong support to its friend Saddam Hussein. Many who will remember Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld's visit to Saddam in 1983. There was a famous handshake which firmed up U.S. support for Saddam. That continued right to the end. And U.S. support for Saddam proved decisive in convincing Khomeini finally to accept the settlement. This was after the U.S. had intervened directly in the Gulf with naval forces to protect Iraqi shipping, and crucially after the U.S. guided missile cruiser, the USS Vincennes, shot down an Iranian airliner in a commercial corridor, killing 290 people. then returned to its port in the United States to receive medals of honor for the achievement. Previously, President Reagan had blamed Iran for Saddam's chemical warfare massacres of Kurds and had blocked congressional condemnation of the atrocity. Well, shortly after that shocking crime, ABC Middle East correspondent Charles Glass discovered Iraqi biological warfare sites. He was using French commercial satellites and defector testimony. His report was aired by ABC, but it was instantly denied by the Pentagon, and the story died until Saddam made a mistake. He committed the sin of defiance himself. 19 months later, invaded Kuwait, and then the very same sites were bombed and were trumpeted as proof that Saddam must be destroyed. The press, of course, accepted all of this quietly without comment, also academic analysts. The intimacy of US Saddam relations was revealed very graphically in 1987 when Saddam's missiles hit a US ship, the USS Stark, in the Gulf, killing 37 seamen. There was no punishment. Now, that's pretty rare. The only other country that can get away with something like that is, in fact, Israel, which did get away with it in 1967 in the attack on the USS Liberty. So you have to have a really close, intimate friendship to be able to get away with things like that. In the case of the Iraqi attack on the Stark, President Reagan immediately declared that Iran was the villain. So accordingly, the US imposed heavy sanctions on Iran, new ones, there already were some, because it was interfering with US naval actions in the Gulf, like the ones I just described, in fact, protecting Iraqi shipping. Well, that pretty much led to the end of the war, and matters continued pretty much the same way. As soon as the war ended, August 1989, the Pentagon invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for advanced training in nuclear weapons production. Of course, that's a severe threat to Iran. A couple months later, by now President Bush, this is Bush #1, President Bush sent a high-level congressional delegation to Iran. It was led by Senate Majority Leader Robert Dole, who was later Republican presidential candidate. The delegation was sent to convey Bush's personal greetings to his good friend Saddam Hussein, and to assure Saddam that he should disregard criticisms by what the delegation called the haughty and pampered press, who are out of control and every once in a while criticize Saddam, but you know, those guys, fake news as it's now called. Well, President Bush also provided subsidized food supplies to the Saddam regime. These were badly needed after the destruction of agricultural areas in the chemical warfare attacks against the Kurdish region. The Anfal operations also sent advanced technology that was adaptable to military production. Some of it was specifically designated for protection of the head of state, our friend Saddam Hussein. Well, a couple months later, Saddam defied or misunderstood maybe orders and invaded Kuwait. And he instantly shifted from highly admired friend to embodiment of evil, much as Iran had done 10 years earlier. The Bush administration feared that Saddam would immediately withdraw from Kuwait, leaving a puppet regime in place. In internal discussions, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell, warned his words that in the next few days, Iraq will withdraw, putting his puppet in, and everyone in the Arab world will be happy. We can't permit that. Therefore, in fact, what was feared, if you look back, was that Saddam would do exactly what the United States had done a few months earlier when it invaded Panama. The invasions are quite similar. The difference was that there were apparently many more civilian casualties in the US invasion of Panama, but the US did invade, put its puppet in. One difference was that the Latin American countries were anything but happy. In fact, they vigorously protested, but of course in vain. Saddam actually made a series of offers for negotiated withdrawal. Now, these were rejected. Evidence was leaked from inside the government, but it was suppressed by the media. It's quite an interesting story. And finally, the US invaded. Iraq was subjected to brutal, destructive bombing, then extremely harsh sanctions that were so severe that the distinguished international diplomats who administered them through the UN both resigned in protest on grounds that the US sanctions were what they called genocidal. Of course, the US was subjected to nothing for its invasion of Panama, nothing more than a Security Council resolution, which the US vetoed along with France and England. So no bombing, no sanctions, no discussion, it's all forgotten. Again, the doctrine of imperial Athens. Well, Iran was not so lucky. Successful defiance is not tolerable. So sanctions were regularly extended, various pretexts, very harsh effects. Sanctions imposed after 2010 alone reduced Iran's economy by 15 to 20%. They blocked growth almost entirely in the subsequent years up till 2015. Sanctions on oil production were particularly damaging. The sanctions were sharply intensified, as you know, last November, after Trump had withdrawn from the nuclear agreement. In this case, the sanctions very clearly designed to punish the population severely in hope that that the regime may somehow collapse. It's hardly not stated, but hardly hidden. Well, the US is a very powerful state. It's the godfather, and US sanctions have a multiplier effect. So other states, even Europe, are afraid to antagonize the global enforcer, which virtually controls international financial transactions. They go through New York mostly, and anybody who tries to evade them can expect severe punishment if the United States is crossed. And of course, as we all know, the long reach of Uncle Sam has extended to this room. The conference cannot be live streamed to Iran because that would provide what's called a service to Iranian scholars that can't be tolerated by the Trump, Pompeo, Bolton triumvirate. It's tempting at this point to borrow a phrase about an axis from the George Bush administration, but that would be impolite, so I'll refrain. Well, the punishment of Iran goes beyond sanctions. The US and Israel openly take pride in cyber war attacks against Iran. These actions are what the Pentagon designates as acts of war, which justify military action in retaliation. But those strictures, of course, again, have to conform to the Athenian doctrine. Every US administration, Obama, everyone else, has declared and continues to declare that all options are open. That's quite an interesting phrase. the phrase is in strict violation to the foundations of international law, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which bans the threat or use of force in international affairs. But that was, of course, established under US initiative, but it's not applicable to the powerful. And the fact that every US leader openly, publicly, radically defies international law receives no comment. You might check and see. I've talked about this occasionally in law schools, and the reaction is kind of interesting, sort of, what else is new, sort of. Of course, there is some comment from people who the National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, McGeorge Bundy, called the wild men in the wings. So they occasionally bring this up, but they can, of course, be dismissed. Well, in public, Iran, like Cuba, other enemies, is not charged with successful defiance of the master. That's for internal documents. Rather, the primary charge, in the case of Iran, for some years, has been that Iran is the greatest threat to world peace and is even developing nuclear weapons. On the question of the threat to peace, the world happens to disagree. There are international polls of public opinion run by the Gallup organization, the main organization. They once only, interestingly, asked the question on their international polls, who is the greatest threat to world peace? The answer came out the wrong way. The United States was far ahead. Nobody else was even close. Iran was barely mentioned. They never asked that question again. And the US population was protected from the bad news by the free press, which refused to publish it. Putting that aside, what exactly is the Iranian threat to peace? Actually, we have an authoritative answer to that from US intelligence. They give regular reports to Congress on the global situation, of course, to talk about Iran. And what they report is that Iranian military expenditures are extremely low by the standards of the region, let alone US standards. So, for example, in 2017, the Iranian military expenditures were 1/7 that of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Sunni oil dictatorships, 1/7 of theirs, let alone Israel or the US. And furthermore, the GCC states receive very advanced technology, the most advanced military technology that the US and its allies export. In contrast, the Iranian military system is mostly obsolete from many years ago because of the sanctions. Well, intelligence also points out that Iranian strategic doctrines are defensive, designed to hold off an invasion long enough for diplomacy to set in. And add that if, they don't know, but if Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons program, that would be part of its deterrent strategy. That deterrence is unacceptable to states that want to be able to rampage freely in the region. But all of this too passes unmentioned. Well, as we all know, even US intelligence has agreed that Iran has lived up to the terms of the joint agreement on nuclear weapons that the US has just rejected, though the current news reports indicate that the Trump administration is trying to concoct some new tale about this, which we'll hear about soon. Well, we might ask finally whether there's any far-reaching solution to the US-Iran confrontation over nuclear weapons. Here's one idea you might consider. First, Iran should have the right to develop nuclear energy like every other state, but not weapons That's in accord with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Secondly, a nuclear weapons-free zone should be established in the region. That would include Iran. Of course, thirdly, the U.S. should end the illegal threats against Iran and should turn to serious diplomacy. Those are three possibilities. They're not original. I didn't make them up. In fact, I'm quoting from polls. These happen to be the preferences of the large majority of both Americans and Iranians. Global polls taken by the World Policy Opinion in 2007, that's right at the height of the confrontation, showed that Americans and Iranians agree very closely on basic issues. When these polls were released, well-known strategic analyst, disarmament specialist Joseph Chirincioni commented, quote him, "The polls show the common sense of both the American and Iranian people, who seem to be able to rise above the rhetoric of their own leaders to find common sense solutions to some of the most crucial questions facing the two nations, favoring diplomatic solutions to their differences. The results," he said, "suggest that," I'm putting it a little differently from his words, so let me make it my statement. They suggest that if the US and Iran were functioning democracies, which neither of them is, then this very dangerous confrontation could probably be resolved peaceably. Well, these are the opinions of the populations, and not the leadership, obviously, or for example, or for that matter, of the experts. They're different. It's an interesting study in the current issue of the Political Science Quarterly, main journal of the Political Science Association. They reviewed opinions among experts and found that there are a few who agree with the populations, but they say they're very marginal, so marginal don't have to be considered. And they mention only one person, in fact, Trita Parsi. Perhaps all that tells us something. Well, let's turn to the second point of agreement between Iranian and American populations. Establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. If you did that, that would terminate any alleged Iranian threat. So what are the prospects for that? Well, no problem with the Arab states. They're strongly in favor of it. In fact, they're the ones who initiated the proposal back in the 1990s. No problem with Iran. They strongly support it, along with G77, the former non-aligned countries. Again, strongly support this goal. Same with the rest of the world, but not unanimously. There's one country that blocks it, the United States, regularly. This comes up regularly at the Non-Proliferation Treaty review meetings. U.S. regularly finds a way to block it. Most recently, Obama, 2015. There are, of course, pretexts, but nobody doubts the reasons. In this case, you can even read them in arms control journals. The reasons are that if there was a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone, Israel's nuclear arsenal would be subject to inspection. In fact, the United States cannot concede its existence. U.S. continues to deny that it exists. Of course, everyone knows that it does. And there's a reason for that. If the U.S. recognized its existence, military aid to Israel would have to stop under U.S. law, assuming the government might follow U.S. law. So anyway, there can't be a nuclear weapons-free zone. We ought to notice that along with Britain, the United States has a special responsibility to devote its efforts to establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. The reason is that when the US and Britain were looking for some kind of thin legal cover for their invasion of Iraq, the two aggressor states appealed to a Security Council resolution 687, 1991, and they claimed falsely that Saddam had violated its demand to end his nuclear weapons program. Well, that resolution has another paragraph, which nobody wants to cite, paragraph 14, which calls in its words for steps towards the goal of establishing in the Middle East a zone free from weapons of mass destruction. And notice that that obligates the United States and Britain, even more than others, to take this initiative seriously. None of this enters into public discussion in the United States, again, apart from the wild men in the wings who repeatedly bring it up, but in vain. Well, these remarks, of course, barely scratch the surface, but a lot of importance is omitted. But I think if you fill in the details, it leaves the basic story pretty much intact, including the shared opinion of Iranian and American publics. Ones I quoted, that the US should end threats against Iran and turn to serious diplomacy. The main point is that the issues are resolvable, and failure to make use of the opportunities might have very grim consequences.